The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Why did he use that word?
God goes to extreme measures to bring the lost to himself.
The greatest gift you will ever give this world is your intimacy with God.
The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all three inside of me. I've got the power right now.
I think what Jesus really wants is people to go. I want to be the answer to Jesus' prayer request.
Welcome to the Fuel for the Harvest podcast.
When this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, then shall the end come.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. This is Nathan.
And this is Charlie. We're your hosts for today, and we're continuing the series of Who is Jesus? And not who do others say that he is, but who does he say he is from his own lips? So today, Jesus says in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then he continues, no one comes to the Father except through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So what does that mean?
Well, let's set the scene for you. So Jesus is getting close to the end of his life. We know that because just a few sentences before this, he's talking to Peter and he's like, hey bro, you're going to deny me 3 times. And then after this, it doesn't take very long. There's a lot that happens, but it doesn't take very long, and we see Jesus on trial and eventually crucified. So the Gospel of John is 21 chapters. We're in chapter 14. Just goes to show how much of the Bible, like the Gospels, is devoted to the cross and the resurrection. Kind of crazy. But yeah.
Except for Mark.
Even still.
But it's a quick book.
Yeah. A lot. Like a significant portion of the Gospels is devoted to like the last week or so of Jesus' life.
That's true. It's like the Passion of the Christ movie. What is that, like a 3-hour movie almost? And it's literally just about his crucifixion.
Right. I mean, the whole thing took like hours and hours anyway. So
I mean, it could have been like a 9-hour movie, I guess.
It could have been. If it was all real time, I guess it could have been like 20 some hours.
Anyway, so Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I think it's important to see a word in there, the.
Yep.
He is not a way,
yeah.
a truth, a life. He is the, capital T-H-E, the only way, truth, life. Outside of Jesus, you will find no truth, you will find no life, you will find no way. You might find some ways, but they're going to be wrong ways, false ways. I may have told this story a long time ago, but it's so vivid in my mind related to this truth. I was speaking at this FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes group at this high school, and it was a different high school than I went to when I was in high school. And I noticed a girl who walked into the back room as a janitor to change the trash, and I recognized her. And then when I finished speaking, someone said, hey, that girl that walked in wanted to talk with you. So I went out and found her out in the lobby, and she said, hey, how's it going? Like, we went to high school together. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. And she's like, I noticed you were speaking. Like, what are you doing there? And I said, oh, well, yeah, I was speaking for this group. And she's like, oh, so did you, like, join the Air Force, the military? And that gets back into my testimony. That was my desire all throughout high school. Everybody knew. I proclaimed it. I was arrogant. I talked about what I was going to accomplish in this world. And so she knew that my life dream had been to join the military. And I said, that's a really great question. Let me tell you what happened. And I told her my story. Like, here's what God has been doing, what Jesus has been doing in my life, what he's been speaking. And it's been really exciting. So he asked me to give up my life dream. He asked me to embrace the fullness of what he wanted for my life. And this is what it's looked like, which is why I'm speaking here today. And she was really interested, like, wow, that's really exciting. And I said, what about you? Like, where are you at spiritually? Are you going to a particular church or thinking about anything? And she's like, well, I'm seeking. I've dabbled in Islam and Buddhism, and I'm kind of interested right now in this Native American spirituality. And I'm like, well, you ought to add to your list Christianity. Why don't you come to church on Sunday and check it out, and we'll have a conversation? She said, that sounds great. I will. She came to church, and I knew that it had to be more than just an invite to church. Like, it needed to be my testimony. We needed to discuss the gospel. So I grabbed a few young people in the church and said, hey, come have lunch with us, so they could hear the conversation too. And she came to lunch. These others came to lunch, and we started to talk. And I said, so what do you think? Let's unpack that. And it's like, hey, let's make sure you know the core message that Jesus died and that he rose. We talked about resurrection in the last episode. It's crucial, and how he can impact our lives, and he wants a relationship with us. And she said, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for explaining. And then I said, so is this something you want to believe in? Is this something you want to follow? And she said, yeah, but I'm wondering, can I mix and match? I really like this Native American stuff, and I like a few pieces of Islam. Can I take those with me and combine them? I said, thanks for your question. It's an honest, really good question. Let me explain that for you. Most people think about Christianity or just life in general, outside of Christianity, outside of the church. Most people think of it like this, that there's some generic God at the top of a mountain, and every religion is a path that will get you to that God. So it doesn't matter which one you take. You'll discover, like, the true God is hidden behind Jesus. The true God is hidden behind Buddha. The true God is hidden behind Allah in Islam. Like, they all lead to this generic God. They're all okay. And I said, that's actually not true. It's inverted. All these religions start at the same basic place with questions about life, and they all have very different answers, very different conclusions, and they all can't be true, because at the end of the day, they start at the tip of the mountain and they all end at the bottom in very different directions that contradict each other. They can't all possibly be true. In fact, I showed her this verse, John 14. He's the way, the truth, and the life. No one except through me.
Right.
And so you can't combine them. I told her, I need to be honest with you. You can't combine them. Acts chapter 4, verse 12, there's a salvation in no one except for in the name of Christ. No one under heaven except for Jesus. And so you need to make a decision to leave behind these practices of Islam, leave behind these practices of Buddhism, leave behind these Native American rituals, and embrace Jesus and only Jesus. That's the decision you have to make.
Right.
She said, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining.
Right.
Like, she wasn't upset. She was grateful that I told her the truth, but with love. And I said, so what do you think? Do you want to make that decision? And she said, I'm not ready yet, but I'll be praying and considering. And amazing what happened. She kept praying and considering and thinking, and she kept coming to the church, surprisingly. I guess maybe not surprisingly in that circumstance, but a few weeks later, had a conversation and said, so how are you processing? And she's like, well, the other day I prayed and I gave my life to Jesus. I made the decision, and I feel different. I'm changed. I'm like, wow, praise God. She ended up getting baptized in that church, and God was really at work in her life. But all to the point, like, Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. You can't have part of him and embrace other pieces too. And
Right.
You've experienced these kind of things as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's all over. I feel like our culture is just inundated with that view that I can pick and choose a little bit here, a little bit there. I mix and match. I know that missionaries in India have a really hard time.
Yeah, Hinduism is tough.
Because Hinduism believes in a multitude of gods, and so they'll affirm Jesus and then keep affirming their other 300 million gods.
He's
as
another
well.
idol on the shelf.
Right. And so I know that it's a very difficult paradigm where they have to say this very thing, that Jesus alone is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no other way to the Father. There's no other way to God. If you want to get to God, it's through Jesus and Jesus alone. People will say, why is it so important that people believe in Jesus? I have a youth group. Man, whenever we do like questions, I try to open it up every 6 months or so for like whatever questions might be on their heart or mind. Almost every time this question, why Jesus? Why do I have to choose Jesus? Well, Jesus says it about himself. Like, if you want to get to God, you have to go through Jesus, and Jesus is God. If you want to get to the Father, you have to go through Jesus. He says it himself. If we're going to take Jesus at his word, that is the only option. And we've seen it also among tribal groups like the Hadzabe. So
before we jump into that, I gotta say, I think just to answer this question that you might be wondering, or some might be wondering, doesn't that seem wrong of God to demand that? Like, it seems like he's kind of jealous. And, like, why isn't he more flexible? Like, that doesn't seem right. And it's true. He is jealous. And that might sound bad for a second, but let me unpack that. I actually think a certain level of jealousy is good. And now you're starting to think, wow, who is this guy? Hold on, just wait a second.
Yeah.
Think about a marriage or romantic relationship. And you might be thinking, bro, you don't want to be jealous. To some extent, yes, and to some extent, no.
You don't want to be super intensely over
I need to control you
Right.
and hold you back. You can't even have a conversation with somebody else in life because they're a man or vice versa. Like, I'm afraid. Don't let insecurity drive your jealousy.
Right.
A foundation of security actually provides some jealousy. If there's a man flirting with my wife,
You're going to have a problem with that.
I have jealousy.
Yeah.
That's not okay. Hey, buddy, she's taken.
Yeah.
Or like my wife would never ever do this, but like if she reciprocated that back, I would have a conversation. What the devil is going on?
What are you
that's not okay.
Right, because what is she communicating to you in that situation?
That my love and relationship is not enough. She needs to seek elsewhere to include. So imagine this. Just imagine this story that happened. There's this guy named Joe, and he's married to a woman named Amanda, and they are recently married. And so one day, Joe comes home from work, and he's really dirty, and he's got grime on his hands. He worked in a car shop, and so he like sees that his wife is like getting dressed up, like putting on her makeup, looking really nice, and he's like, "Oh man, like why is she getting dressed up? Like did I forget we have a date or something? Like, oh no, I'm in big trouble." And so he's like, "Hey honey, I'm home," like hoping that she'll give him some clues, and she's just like, "Hey," like doesn't say anything, and he's like, "Okay." He's like, "Hey, so like, what are you getting dressed up for?" Like, "Oh yeah, for tonight." And he's like, "Oh no, like
what is tonight?"
Yeah, like he can't remember. And he's like, "Oh, should I like change my clothes and get dressed up too?" And she's like, "Oh, it's up to you. It doesn't matter." He's like, "What in the world?" He's like, "Okay, listen, like, I'm sorry, but I can't remember what's going on tonight." And she's like, "Oh, I'm going on a date with Sam." He's like, "What? How dare you? What do you mean? That's so wrong. Like, you can't go out with somebody else. We're married." And she's like, Well, yeah, we are, but you're my first favorite. But
I have other favorites.
I have others that I like too. Like, you're always going to be my best. But it's okay if I have some others, right?
And you're going to say, "Of course not."
No. That's absurd. Like, you need to have one devotion, one true love. And that's how God sees us. Like, we're letting our hearts and our lives be devoted to others and mixing and matching. And his jealousy says, "No, my love's enough. Come to me and me alone." And that's a healthy jealousy.
Yeah. We see that very kind of picture that you just painted about cheating on your spouse. It's all throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I mean, time and time and time again, God compares the Israelite nation to a woman sleeping around with all kinds of
To
other...
a whore.
Yeah.
It says it in the scriptures.
And like, it gets graphic. Ezekiel 23:20. Don't look it up. No, look it up. It's the word of God, but it's graphic. Rated X, not just R. It's rated X. And but that's, God takes it personally when you go lusting after other gods or lusting after other things. So
we have seen this in our culture. We've also seen it around the world.
Right, exactly. So we've seen this with the Hodsbay. We've had lots of long conversations about why you can't worship the SUN, the fireball in the sky, and the Son of God, Jesus. You have to choose one or the other.
We'll preach this message like, hey, here's what Jesus has done, but we don't leave it there. We say, if you want to follow Jesus, you will begin today stop worshiping the sun in the sky and stop interacting with your ancestor spirits and only pray to Jesus, only worship Jesus. And are you ready to make that decision? And that's the message we preach, because otherwise they think that Jesus is a truth and a way, and so are their ancestor spirits. They're another way, and let's do both. Let's placate both ways.
Right, and believe you me, we have been chastised by many an anthropologist for screwing up their culture and so much. Anyway,
that's just God redeeming their culture and working in it. But there are Hodsabay people. I'm remembering this. Some people respond, "Okay, I'm ready." Some are like nonchalant, I don't care. Others are angry with us. One time I remember this old guy like, no,
I won't
like,
do that.
why would I do that? I like the son.
Right.
He's helped me. And I'm like, no, listen, look at this Jesus. And he's like, no, you guys are stupid.
Yeah.
Like, basically is his response to us.
Right. But that's something that we have to do. It's such a dilemma. Like, you don't want to make people angry, obviously. Like, you want to like try and represent Jesus and all that stuff. But the nature of the gospel is very offensive. A, you're broken, you need to be fixed. B, there's one God in heaven, and his name is Jesus, and you can only worship him. And that's it. And you can't worship your other gods. And you can't be like, well, I'm a foot in my wooden idol statues, and I'm a foot in God. This is funny. So I can't remember which prophet. I think it's Jeremiah or Isaiah. So he's making fun of idol worshipers. And he's like, listen, you people, take a log and you cut it in half. Half the wood you carve into your little idol and you worship it, and half the wood you use to cook your food. And he's just pointing at the insane absurdity of worshiping something that you use to cook your food. Like, that's incredibly idiotic. Yeah. And so you just got to be conscientious and careful.
Elijah says something similar to with the prophets of Baal.
Yeah.
They're going to have a show off. He's like, well, let's find out who the one true God is.
Yeah.
Let's find out. Let's build this altar. Let's put the logs on it, and let's let the true God ignite this thing with fire. And he's like, you guys go first. And they start dancing around, doing their rituals, and nothing comes. Okay, we better try harder. They start cutting themselves. And tell me that's not demonic. But they start cutting themselves. Our God will hear us. Our God will hear us. Let's keep cutting ourselves, and he'll answer. And Elijah's sitting back, almost like he has a sweet tea or something. Like, I just imagine this funny picture. Like, is your God not going to answer? Is he asleep? You better try harder to wake him up. And then he's like,
maybe he's on vacation.
He's like, is your God on the toilet? It literally says that. Is he relieving himself? Oh, you guys better try harder. Your God sounds like he's on the toilet somewhere. He's going to be a while. Yeah. And like, who says that? And then Elijah comes out, and when he says one word to God, one prayer to God, the fire of heaven, and just to make sure that it was true, he's like, oh, hold on, grab some buckets of water. Oh, that's not enough. Another bucket of water. Douses this
massive,
thing.
large containers of water.
Makes a moat around it. The moat is filled with water. And then he says one prayer, and fire of God comes out, consumes the water, consumes the altar. There's almost nothing left, and they all notice who the one true God is.
Right. Which I love about God. Like, he's in the business of revealing himself to people.
He is. And I think that happens. There's lots of stories from the mission field in the most dark places on this planet where the demonic flees and the other gods are shown to be false, and the one true God is revealed in and through the person of Jesus. So this happens. I think there's a battle that goes on, though, in the human heart to be fully devoted. And to leave behind, like this happens commonly in the Muslim world as we're working in Asia and countries that would be like these Middle Eastern type countries in Africa where Muslims have kind of hubs where there's regions of 100% Islam and there's darkness prevailing. Forge ambassadors are at work right now.
Sure. And
these are indigenous boots on the ground partners of our ministry with Forge who embrace the DNA of everyday people can make extraordinary impact in ordinary places, kingdom laborers who love Jesus and love others and advance his kingdom. They're multiplying these types of people in these places. And recently they've launched out to unreached villages and found people interested in Christ, and they've multiplied across places that are really dangerous. Persecution. I mean, we're talking countries that are within the top 5 most dangerous countries for Christians. And we've heard reports and we've had conversations where these Muslims are saying, we want this Jesus. We believe he is the way, the truth, the life. We agree with you. We acknowledge this. But they fear the danger. Right. And so they're afraid, therefore they don't commit that he's the only way. In practice, they acknowledge. It's like there's this story in the book of John where there's this guy healed by Jesus. And there's 3 responses to this encounter. The Pharisees who hear about it are furious and reject Jesus and his work. There's the parents of this guy who believe, like, well, our son was changed.
Right.
But they don't acknowledge that to the Pharisees publicly. They're like, oh, no, we follow the real religious ways. Don't worry. Like, they're afraid of what's to come.
Right.
And then there's the guy who publicly confesses, this is what Jesus has done for me. And I see these three responses across the world. Like, okay, we're going to reject it because we like to hold on to these other ways and combine them.
Right.
Or we acknowledge it, but we're afraid to confess it publicly for whatever reason, culturally, religiously, or all in radical, let's embrace this. He's the only way, and I'm going to proclaim it from the rooftops.
Right. And ultimately, that's what we have to do. We have to proclaim him as the one way. When I was a kid, I had a baseball hat that had like one of those street signs that says one way, and it said Jesus is one way. That's who I used to be. Or I
Wait,
still proclaim that.
You don't believe that anymore?
I still proclaim that. I still proclaim that, but I proclaim it.
That's who I used to be until I embraced all the religions of the world.
I proclaim it with my words and with my actions, not just with a baseball hat anymore.
Not just with a Hobby Lobby Mardell t-shirt.
Right, exactly. And we're not against those things. No. We're just saying if that's the only thing you're doing,
let's do a little more.
Let's do more.
Let's love in action. Let's not. I'll tell you, I wore the t-shirts and I acted like a Pharisee. I wore the political t-shirts too. Like it have like the design of a particular presidential candidate, but then it would have Jesus. Yeah. I wore all that.
Yeah.
And yet I acted like a Pharisee to people. I was like, you guys are idiots if you think differently.
If you're that would be what we call hypocrisy, you know, saying one thing with the t-shirt and saying an entirely different thing.
I appreciate that.
Well, I was also a hypocrite. Still sometimes am. Don't want to be, but still struggle. Anyway, long story short.
What happens in our culture, I think, is the question. Like, okay, in the West, now you might be listening from all sorts of different countries and different contexts, and some of these stories have related to you based on your religious background or your cultural background in your region. But in the West,
right? What kinds of things happen?
What do we have to lay down? Like, what are we mixing and matching? Like, what do we want to hold on to? One hand on Jesus and one hand in the world. What does that look like for us in the West?
So obviously, we've got the religious things that we're like mixing and matching, like the story you told at the beginning of this podcast. But I think it goes even beyond that. Jesus says in the Gospels that you can't serve both God and money.
That's a huge one.
Or God and stuff, depending on your translation.
Well, mammon, which is money, it's wealth.
Yeah, wealth. I've heard it translated stuff, money, whatever. Anyway, long story short.
But Jesus is talking about money, essentially the whole context.
Right. The important thing to take note of is I think that is probably one of the most significant things that we have to lay down is wealth. Our culture is obsessed with wealth. We're obsessed with comfort. We're obsessed with self. Like we worship ourselves as God. I think that is a super common one where we I worship Jesus, but I also worship me. And we bow down at the idol of ourselves.
People don't say that, though.
Well, I know people don't say that, but they do it.
Right, so how is the question. I think, because otherwise we'll just say, well, I don't do that. Like, how does that look? And I think, number one is arrogance, pride, lack of humility, like, well, my way's better than yours always. Right. And I'm going to shoot down other people just to say I'm right.
Yep.
And man, you're kind of holding on to the idol of yourself and your arrogance along with Christ.
Absolutely.
I think with wealth and money and stuff, as you said, I'm about Jesus and I love him, but I deserve more. Or you should give me more because I'm worth more. Or, hey, you know what? I'm really seeking Jesus, but I don't want to sacrifice, so I'm going to seek after all the things of the world and do the best I can to gain more wealth. Right. And it's like, whoa, slow down. I'm not against wealth. There's a scripture in Timothy that's like, God has given us all these things for our pleasure, for our enjoyment, it says. But it also says in that same passage, be content with little and be content with much.
Right.
So what does that content mean? It means our eyes are on Jesus. We're content with him, not with our circumstances, with our items. And so we have to be very careful because Jesus said it's harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. We better be careful because in the West, overall, we're wealthy.
Yeah. I mean,
not that there's not homeless people, not that there's not people that are struggling, but statistically, far more than the rest of the world.
Right. I mean, the average person has access to clean water, has access to a roof over their head, like the vast majority of people, whereas there are entire populations around the world, no clean water, no sewer, no food, or food instability, things like
So-
that. Like all that to say we're wealthy.
and so what do we? I think the question is, what are we doing with our wealth? Are we using it to advance God's kingdom, or are we using it just to build ourselves up, make our lives more comfortable, make ourselves feel better, and we don't really care about others? Like, use it to bless others and to build God's kingdom. Don't just say it's all about me.
Right. We really have to be careful. And you said something a little while ago that I don't want to glaze over. You said
Yeah.
it so quickly. What does it mean to be content? It means to be content with Jesus. So
Right.
Jesus is what you have. Even I love that song, Take the World But Give Me Jesus. Like, that has been my prayer on many occasion, where it's like, the temptation is to hold tightly to the things of this world, to find security in them, to say, hey, if I just have enough money, if I just have a big enough house, if I have the relationships I want in my life, if I just have a wife, if I just have enough kids, if I just have like the job promotion, if I just like, we want to find security in all of these things of the world, and we end up holding on to them. The foolish thing is, the crazy foolish thing that we're doing to ourselves is that all of those things could be taken away from us in an instant.
Yeah.
Like, literally a nuclear bomb goes off, gone, all of it. But Jesus, he will not perish. He will not be gone. He is everlasting from before us, while we're here, and way long after we're gone. Jesus is forever. And it, like, the idea that we would find security in anything other than him, like, when you start to see what we're holding on to, it makes no sense. Like, the idea that, like, the U.S. dollar, for example, inflation's going on right now. Like, we're holding on to U.S. dollars. We're holding on to U.S. dollars as if, like, they are God. And look how easily 7% of your God is being torn away from you in a moment. Like, Jesus does not suffer from the issues of inflation.
Yeah,
like, he will be with you always.
Here, I think it's important to make this clear. We are not anti-wealth.
Right.
We are not anti-entrepreneurism. I like entrepreneurism. I like business. I like growing wealth. I like multiplication.
In fact, we're utilizing those concepts in the mission field in order to multiply the mission.
It's how you use it and how you view it and where your heart's at. You can't. Money is not the root of all evil.
The love.
The love of money is the root of all evil. So consider your heart. Do you desire the things of the world and hunger for them and work for them as much or more than you hunger to spend time with God and tell people other about Jesus and advance his kingdom? I love when I meet wealthy people who think entrepreneurially, think outside the box, and make lots of money, but say, man,
how can I give it away?
How can I help advance God's kingdom with this?
Yep.
How can I multiply more so we can do more?
Yep.
I like thinking that way, but let's just be careful where our hearts are.
Right.
And we're not holding on to things as our idols more than God himself. And that might be a relationship. You brought up relationships. Like, man, do we start to try and love this person and serve them more than God himself? And Jesus made it clear. If you don't hate your father, mother, brother, and sister, you cannot be my disciple. Now, what does that word hate mean? It doesn't mean hate like you think it does. Like, I hate you, you're stupid. It doesn't mean that. No. In the Jewish context, that word, depending on how it was used, would often mean reject or love less.
Right.
And this is Jesus' context. He's using that word to illustrate that your love for God must be so great that if people saw you loving him, they'd say, man, you don't love your family very much. And you do love your family so much, but you do so much more for God. You love him so much greater. You hunger for him more. Like, that's what Jesus is saying.
Right. It's a relative term.
Yes.
So relative to how much you love God, it's as if you hate your family, not that you actually hate your family.
And so evaluate, like, man, do I have a relationship that those people and what they say has a stronger weight than what God and his word says?
Yeah.
That's how you can evaluate. Like, if they say something, do I prayerfully evaluate? Now, caveat, honor, respect, and obey your parents. That's a God-given thing.
Command.
Love one another, prefer one another. serve one another, encourage one another. But at the end of the day, does God and his word have more weight and more value and more pull on your life than any other person?
Right. It reminds me of Solomon. You know how he had 1,000 wives and concubines. What did that lead him to? It led to the eventual separation of the northern and southern kingdom of Israel and Judah, which ultimately led to like the 10 lost tribes of Israel and all this
and before
terrible
that,
consequences. And the reason for that is because of idol worship.
Right.
These wives, like
they
Solomon
worshipped
was
other
all
gods.
about. He's supposed to be the most wise man in the entire world, yet he was deceived by women, by all of his wives. And men and women can equally deceive each other. So I'm not out to like say women deceive people, but what I'm trying to say is he had valued these wives, and he wanted to have lots of whatever, and ended up going down a path of idol worship, and he let all of his wives put little idol worship stations in the temple of God, and it was like this super sick, nasty, twisted, messed up thing, and had lasting consequences for the people of Israel, because Solomon lost his focus on the one true God.
His heart became divided.
Right.
So Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We will miss the fullness of God and his life for our lives, the fullness of life that he has for us. We'll miss the fullness of life in Jesus' kingdom if we're divided among many ways.
Absolutely.
Many quote-unquote truths, even though there's one truth and many paths. He is the one true life, the one true way.
Yep. Even though it's hard to tell people that it's true,
So
and we have to proclaim it as true.
Continue to evaluate. Is he your everything? And do you proclaim him as the everything? I think that's ultimately how I would sum it up.
Yep, absolutely. Well, hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. We look forward to hearing from you guys or hanging out with you guys again next week. That's what I meant. And hope you have a great rest of your day. God bless.